A death loop is when, without pilot input, the kite steers significantly to one side. That makes the kite loop, create a lot of power and drag the pilot, potentially causing a major accident. This video looks at death loops in detail, including what causes them, how to stop them, and how to avoid them in the first place. Let's begin by looking at 3 methods of stopping a death loop. In these examples, I fabricate a death loop by jamming the left steering line behind the control bar, so that it remains tense and turns the kite left for an anti-clockwise loop. The first method of dealing with a death loop is simply to use your safety steps. When a kite starts steering, even though you're not touching the bar, that's a clear warning sign to eject your chicken loop. The kite should then flag out on the safety line. If it does not, then ejecting your leash should free you from the kite. In the vast majority of death loop scenarios, these steps will work. In a few rare situations, these steps might not work, and I'll be looking at that later in the video. Another way to end a death loop is to counter steer it. You steer the control bar in the opposite direction to which the kite is already turning. In this example, the kite is auto steering left, so pulling the right line enough will stop the kite turning. If you can stop the kite looping, then it will not generate as much pull. Once the kite sits on the water, you have a chance to untangle the cause of the death loop. Here I remove the left steering line from the bar and then inspect my lines to make sure they're all in order. Counter steering can be extremely effective. It stops the death loop quickly, plus you don't need to apply much tension since you're only adjusting the steering. In light wind, counter steering will typically backstall the kite like this. In stronger wind, the kite is likely to keep flying after you counter steer. Here, I pull the left steering line down to my harness as if it were caught on my harness to mimic a death loop. I then pull in the right steering line just as far to stop the death loop. The kite keeps flying, of course, so I then pull the right steering line in a little closer to guide the kite down to the water. Once the kite is down, a lot of its force disappears and you have a good chance of fixing whatever caused the death loop. The stronger the wind, the more dangerous counter steering becomes. Another way to stop a death loop is to flag out the kite manually like this. You have to pull in a single line significantly. In this case, I used the left steering line since it's already being pulled in a bit. When you pull in any line enough, the kite will move closer to you, then the other lines will become slack. At that point, the kite is flagged out on the end of the line that you pulled in. Typically, you pull in about as much line as the span of the kite in order to do this. Manually flagging a kite out can be problematic. You have to pull in quite a lot of line. The bigger the kite span, the more line. And if you're also getting dragged by the kite, then this line can get wrapped on you and perpetuate further death loops. Also, as you manually flag out a kite, you will have to handle pretty much the entire force of the kite in your hands on a thin line. Here, my manual flag out worked easily, but don't be deceived. This is only a 4 meter squared kite in about 10 knots. If it were a 9 meter squared kite in about 25 knots, then you could easily lose a chunk of hand. So, manually flagging out only really works in very light wind, or perhaps if the kite is already downed and not pulling much. So what should you do if a kite def loops? If you're a novice kiter, then your best bet is to simply go for the safety steps and do so quickly. For most def loop types, over 95%, safety steps will work, either flagging out the kite or releasing it completely. If instead of using your safety steps quickly, you try something else and fail, then the kite can keep looping like this. Here, the kiter tries to counter steer but fails, and as a result the kite loops a few more times. In this case the kiter was absolutely fine, but those extra def loops could knock you out, flip you over so you can't use your safety, or drag you into a wall. The risk caused by delaying safety steps is massive. If your safety steps don't work, then it's well worth attempting counter steering, at least pulling any steering line and seeing what happens. Then you could also try to get any lines off your harness if there are any stuck there. And then you could also try cutting any tense lines with your line knife. I mentioned the line knife last because finding and using a line knife while getting dragged is difficult. So safety steps are best for novice kiters. If, however, you have enough experience, then counter steering can be more effective in a number of def loop scenarios. You need to be experienced enough to judge the risk and to countersteer without mistake. And whether you're experienced enough, of course, will be wind speed dependent. In only 10 knots, pretty much all kiters of a couple of years experience will be able to countersteer a def loop safely, whereas in 30 knots, almost no kiters could do it. What you can't see here is that I'm either in the air or skimming on the surface of the water, and I'm pressing down the tips of my feet like a rudder to prevent myself from flipping around. There are, however, several different types of def loop with different solutions for each. So now I'll walk through those different types of def loop and look at how to deal with them. Importantly, for each of these I'll explain how to avoid them. As with def loops, I'd say prevention is better than cure. Let's start with the type of def loop where your safety steps do not work. This is when your harness hook or body gets tangled with your bar or lines. In this case, ejecting the chicken loop and leash usually does not help. If you're hooked on your bar, then counter steering is much more effective than safety steps. If you can stop that loop, then you should be able to get your lines off of your harness. If you know that you're hooked on your bar or caught on your lines, even if you're a beginner, even if the wind's quite strong, then it's best to try counter steering first. If you see that your bar is stuck down by your hip, then you're probably caught on your bar or lines. Importantly, it's possible to avoid getting caught on your bar. You simply need some good kiting habits. Here, for example, the kiter self-launched when they didn't need to. There were plenty of other kiters around. They also rushed to grab the bar, and as a result they ended up with the bar flipped. It's always safer to leave the bar out and not hold on to it before flying a kite. You don't need to touch the bar. Then take a moment to orientate the bar correctly before flying. With the bar flipped, of course, the kite does not respond as normal. Even though the kite behaved strangely, the kiter kept holding on to the bar. Instead, remember, if a kite behaves strangely, release the bar immediately. Also, you should have a hand on the chicken loop eject during a launch or self-launch, so that you can eject the kite if a launch goes badly. Then we have yet another bad habit. As he crashes, he turns the bar fully. This helps the bar get hooked on the harness. Instead, when you crash, whether on the beach or in the water, either push the bar away or hold the bar straight and out in front of you. After crashing, it's also a good habit to immediately check your bar and lines. You see here, there's a window of about 16 seconds before the kite takes off. That's enough time to inspect the bar and lines and clear them from the harness, preventing the deaf loop. The more experienced of a kiter you are, the quicker you will be at spotting when your lines are not in order. Any of those habits I've outlined there will avoid this type of deaf loop. Next, let's move on to the most common type of deaf loop, which is getting a line wrapped around the bar. We'll begin with a steering line wrapped on the bar. Note, with a steering line wrap, the chicken loop eject should work as normal and flag out the kite on a single line. That's because the safety line is not obstructed. With a steering line wrap, if you have enough experience, counter steering is also very effective. You just have to bring in both steering lines equally. In this example, the kiter almost succeeds in counter steering, but doesn't quite pull in the red line as far as the blue line is jammed in. It's also very common to get the center lines caught around the bar. In this case, there is now a high chance that the chicken loop eject will not do its job. Friction will likely jam the safety line onto the bar. Importantly though, the leash eject will still work and free you from the kite. For more experienced kiters, with a center line wrap, counter steering will be very effective. Importantly, line wraps can be avoided. Most line wraps are caused when a novice kiter stalls the kite, creating line slack and allowing lines to wrap around the bar. In a similar fashion, this can also happen when a kiter hits their kite into the water. The kite stops suddenly, but the rider keeps moving towards the kite. This slacks the lines for a moment, allowing the lines to get tangled on the bar. Luckily, there's a lot of solutions to this problem. Firstly, about half of deaf loops happen when a kiter slacks their lines a bit, either crashing or stalling the kite, and then at the same time they steer the bar hard. Slack lines plus hard steering can easily get a line caught on the bar. Instead, if you crash or stall the kite, try to keep the bar out and level. If you can do this with one hand, then you can even use the other hand to clear any lines off the bar. This habit alone would stop about half of all deaf loops. Another way to prevent these deaf loops is to also get in the habit of checking your bar and lines as soon as possible after a crash. Here, for example, there was a window of 7 seconds to clear the lines from the bar before the kite pulls them tense. Another way that you might end up with too much slack in your lines is from riding downwind too quickly. This can happen easily when foiling, riding on a wave, or after a powered kite loop that propels you downwind. With experience, you'll learn to spot when the lines are starting to go slack, then turn away from that downwind course to straighten out the lines. As you gain understanding of how a power kite works, you will eventually stop stalling and crashing it, which will then cut your chances of a deaf loop dramatically. The Kitesurf College playlist has lots of tutorials looking at stalling, downwinding, flying a kite in light wind, and much more. Deaf loops can be started when the kite or bridles are not arranged correctly. For example, if a bridle is caught on a wingtip like this, or if a bridle wraps around the top of a kite, or if a kite gets inverted. For any of these abnormal kite or bridle positions, the kite can easily get damaged. So I'd recommend using safety steps to flag out the kite as soon as possible and cut the force on it, rather than trying to countersteer. There's quite a few deaf loop examples where safety steps fail due to the type of safety system. Here, for example, the bar uses a dual centerline flagout, which fails to stop the def loop. In this case, a more modern single-line flagout system would have worked. A snapped line or snapped bridle can make the kite steer to one side. A partially snapped bridle can cause a def loop, but your safety systems will work. A snapped steering line can make the kite turn, but simply pushing the bar out should stop that. A snapped centerline can make the kite spiral, although the kite shouldn't be too powerful and will probably drop to the water. For all of these scenarios, your safety steps will work well. If it is the safety line that has snapped, then the chicken loop eject would release the kite completely, which is better than risking injury. Of course, if your safety line snaps and you're experienced enough, and the kite's not pulling much, then you could manually flag out the kite. You can avoid line snaps by simply inspecting your lines and replacing where necessary.
Here are a few final tips on def loops. Firstly, wind speed changes everything. In 15 knots, you might get 10 seconds to fix your def loop. In 30 knots, you might not even have a second to react correctly. Also, because beginners are far more likely to end up in def loops, it makes sense for them to avoid strong wind at first. Build experience in lighter wind. When you reach the point of not stalling and crashing the kite so often, you'll be safer in strong wind and less likely to get involved in a strong wind def loop.
Equipment makes a big difference as well. Bars without mouldings can def loop a bit more easily. That's because the steering lines can droop freely even with a little line slack. Mouldings on the lines keep the initial parts of the lines projected away from yourself, which makes it harder for the lines to droop behind the bar. Also, bar mouldings combined with a compact harness hook and a snug chicken loop make it very difficult to get hooked onto your bar. Busier bar designs with extraneous lines and ropes can jam around the control bar easily. Cleaner bars are harder to jam and a bit easier to troubleshoot.
If you have any more def loop examples, perhaps some types that I haven't covered in this video, then please do share them in the comments. Also, if you have any questions or tips of your own, feel free to share them in the comments as well. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video helps you deal with def loops.